To sew a sleeve on the round or a set-in sleeve, we're going to first sew up the sleeve seam, and then on the bodice we're going to sew the shoulder and the side seam, and then we're going to put the sleeve inside the bodice and stitch around the sleeve. And this just gives a much nicer finish than sewing the sleeve in flat because of the way that the seam allowances are able to fall. If you're sewing something like a jersey fabric, a t-shirt, or if your sleeve head is really flat, then you're fine to sew it in flat, but most of the time a set-in sleeve is much nicer. So if you take your bodice and you turn it so it's the wrong side out, then you can take your sleeve and you can turn it so it's the right side out. And we're going to put the sleeve inside the bodice so that the right sides are facing. So you want to make sure that your side seam and your sleeve seam are the nice finished edges, the outside edge, and that they're facing. The other thing to check, obviously when you have a pair of sleeves, is that the notches are in the right position. So the double notch indicates that it's the back of the pattern, and the single notch indicates that it's the front of the pattern. So you want to check that when you put it in and the seams are matching, that your double notch is at the back and so is the double notch of the bodice, and vice versa on the front. So it always helps to press your sleeve seam allowance towards the front because you usually press the seams on the bodice towards the back. So this just means that there's not any extra bulk of all the layers stacking up on top of each other. So I'm going to make sure that my underarm seam and my side seam are matching here, and I'm going to put a pin in to hold it in place. Then I'm going to match the notch on the front and pin those in place. So with the sleeve, normally the underarm bit, so between the front notch and the back notch on the underarm section, will be exactly the same as the bodice, whereas this top section might have extra ease. So I'm going to place a pin at the front notch and then at the back notches to hold those in place. Then you can place some pins in between because this bottom section should match exactly. Then you can find the notch at the top of the sleeve and match it with the shoulder seam. Then you'll notice that between the front and the back that there's more volume in the sleeve head than there is in the armhole here. So we want to evenly spread out this amount of volume. And the thing that can really help is if you run a gather stitch in your sleeve before you start pinning, and then you can use the gather stitch to bring the pieces together. So if you don't run a gather stitch, this is best if there's only a little bit of ease. You just want to put the sleeve in just so that the edges are starting to touch. And what you'll notice is that although the sleeve kind of ripples at the top, the cut edge, where the actual stitch line is, there might not be as much ease as you think. It's just that normally it feels like more because the seam allowance is curved, so it's getting bigger as it kind of carries around that curve. So I would just place a few pins in and just try and spread out a little bit of that ease. There's not too much in here, so I'm just going to keep pinning. So again, I'm just going to spread out any of the fabric here. Make sure it's kind of evenly spread out. Don't worry about the outside edge. I'm just checking at this point where I'm going to run my stitch line that the fabric is coming together at that point. I'm not worried about these outside edges. And when you're sewing a sleeve, you want to start at the underarm and you're going to go all the way around and meet back at the underarm, and this just makes sure that any stitching is kind of hidden at that point. Just go nice and slow and make sure that the fabric isn't gathered or puckered. So it might feel like it is on the machine, but as long as the area that you're stitching is flat, you don't need to worry about the other areas. You don't need to worry about the outside edge. You just need to make sure that the area that you're stitching is nice and flat. So as you go on the machine, just keep checking and making sure that it's nice and flat. Also, on some machines, there's a section that you can pull off, which means that you can put the sleeve all the way into the machine. And another note is that once you've stitched your sleeve, if you find that there are a few puckers in the fabric, you don't need to unpick the whole thing. You just need to unpick the section that's pleated and then a little bit more, and you can spread out the fabric in that area. So don't worry, this happens even to the most experienced sewists. So that's how you sew a set-in sleeve.